This is from 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1. Paul says this to Timothy. In the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and in view of his appearing in his kingdom, I solemnly urge you, proclaim the message. Be persistent whether the time is favorable or unfavorable. Convince, rebuke, and encourage with the utmost patience in teaching. For the time is coming when people will not put up with sound doctrine, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own desires, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander away to myths. As for you, Timothy, always be sober, endure suffering, do the work of an evangelist, carry out your ministry fully. Now we're moving into another sermon in this series in which we're going to begin to identify voices that will feel like God's voice, but will not be. We must beware the voice that encourages distrust in God's prophets and apostles. God's prophets and apostles are the ones who wrote Holy Scripture. The prophets that God called from the people of Israel wrote the First Testament, those first 39 books. The New Testament was written or authorized, one or the other, by the apostles of Jesus, the 12 individuals that Jesus chose, that he spent at least 3, maybe 4 years ministering to, that he entrusted with the keys to the kingdom. The New Testament was written by them. So what we have in the Bible is a generational project by the people of Israel, initiated at Mount Sinai when God told the Israelites to write down what God had done, and completed by the death of the last of the apostles of Jesus. So what I'm saying is, beware the voice that encourages distrust of the prophets or the apostles. Chapter 18, verse 1. In those days there was no king in Israel, and in those days the tribe of the Danites was seeking for itself a territory to live in. For until then no territory among the tribes of Israel had been allotted to them. So the Danites sent 5 valiant men from the whole number of their clan, from Zorah and from Eshtaol, to spy out the land and to explore it. They said to them, "Go explore the land." When they came to the hill country of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, they stayed there. While they were at Micah's house, they recognized the voice of the young Levite. So they went over and asked him, "Who brought you here? What are you doing in this place? What is your business here?" He said to them, "Micah did such and such for me, and he hired me, and I've become his priest." Then they said to him, "Inquire of God, that we may know whether the mission we are undertaking will succeed." The priest replied, "Go in peace. The mission you are on is under the eye of the Lord." So when the Israelites first came into the land of Canaan under the leadership of Joshua, God had actually assigned the Danites, the tribe of Dan, a piece of property on the coast. So God had given them that property, but there's a problem for the people of Dan. They didn't like that property, and the reason they didn't like it is because the Philistines lived there. So when the text says that they didn't have land allotted to them out of the tribes of Israel, what it means is God gave them land somebody else was living in, and it just so happens that they're one of the most powerful nations in the land of Canaan at the time. So it's not that Dan didn't have any land, it's that they didn't like the land they were given. And so they decide to go out and look for different land. If some of you who've been here, you remember the story of Samson. Samson was from this tribe. He was from the tribe of Dan. But Samson's selfishness led to the Danites living as exiles because they had no place to live. And so it leads them to decide that rather than fighting this very difficult enemy, they're going to go find a less challenging territory to conquer. Now Dan is probably worried. The Danites are probably worried about this move because they know that technically they're forsaking the inheritance God had given them. And so they're looking for another one, which is probably why when they find a priest, who shouldn't be a priest, some of us remember the story from last week, this guy's a Levite. Levites took care of the tabernacle, but they were not allowed to be priests. To be a priest, you had to be a son of Aaron. And so they go to a false priest who's happy to tell them, yeah, God's good with it. God wants you to do this. God's with you. we can always find someone in a position of trust who will give us permission to do what we already want to do. If we are to hear God's voice in our day, we must stop seeking permission to disobey. There will never be a shortage of voices who will encourage us in our disloyalty to God. For most people, it's actually easier to do that. But we must be suspicious, church, of voices that tell us something that we deeply want to hear. Second, we have to beware the voice that recommends a faster route. We must beware the voice that recommends a faster route. Look with me at chapter 18 now in verse 7. I'm going to read verses 7 to 10, and then I'm going to skip to the end where they actually fulfill what they talk about in 7 to 10. So I'll read 7 to 10, then move on to verse 27. We find these words. The 5 men went on, and when they came to Laish, they observed the people who were there living securely, after the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and unsuspecting, lacking nothing on earth, and possessing wealth. Furthermore, they were far from the Sidonians, and they had no dealings with Aram. They have no treaty partners, no defenders. That's what they're saying. When they came to their kinsfolk at Zorah and Eshtaol, they said to them, "What do you report?" They said, "Come, let us go up against them, for we've seen the land, and it's very good. Will you do nothing? Do not be slow to go, but enter in and possess the land. When you go, you'll come to an unsuspecting people. The land is broad. God has indeed given it into your hands, a place where there is no lack of anything on earth." Moving on to verse 27. The Danites, having taken what Micah had made, and the priest who belonged to him, we'll get back to that, came to Laish, to a people quiet and unsuspecting, put them to the sword, and burned down the city. There was no deliverer, because it was far from Sidon, and they had no dealings with Aram. It was in the valley that belongs to Bet-Rehob. They rebuilt the city and lived in it. They named the city Dan after their ancestor Dan, who was born to Israel, but the name of the city was formerly Laish. Then the Danites set up the idol for themselves. And we'll go on after that. Now, it looks like a great country. It's very, very peaceful. It's very, very easy. And they just had the blessing from the priest to go on this journey. So when they go up there and they find that this is a lush land, it's got plenty of resources, there are no enemies, and the people, they don't even have weapons. They're all pacifists. It's got to be for us. It's easy. Don't conquer the Philistines. That's impossible. Conquer these poor people. They couldn't even defend themselves. Easier, shorter, simpler is appealing to us. Shortcuts, whether we're talking about reading or spirituality or business or farming, whatever it is, shortcuts are for things that are not significant. But there are no shortcuts in heeding God's voice, and there are no shortcuts in doing God's will. But the Danites wanted a shortcut because it was too hard to live where God put them. They wanted someplace that was easier. God wanted them to conquer the Philistines because for 450 years, we found out with Abraham, God had been merciful to the Philistines and to the peoples of Canaan. He had been working with them, but they had refused his voice. And so for 450 years, he had shown them mercy. And now when Israel was coming into the land, God had decided it was time for judgment to come on those nations. He did it to his own people later, when they were taken over and sent into exile. So this was the time of judgment for the Philistines. It's why the Danites were commanded to go in. But there was no war that God had or time of judgment on these poor people living in the north. But they were an easier target. So the Danites disobeyed God to do the easier thing. And then they figured it must be God's will, because if it's easy, it's for me. Dan's shortcut, though, would eventually be their doom. Had they stayed where they were, when the kingdoms of Israel divided into north and south, they would have been, most of them, kept south of the line, which meant they would have been in the tribe of Judah, as some of the Benjamites were, their neighbor tribe, and as the tribe of Simeon was, and as many Levites were. And so when the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered by the Assyrians, and all 10 of those tribes were thrown into exile, never to be found again, Dan wouldn't have been part of them. But because they ran away from where God gave them and went up to the north, When the 10 tribes fall, Dan is with them. Matter of fact, they get wiped out first. Had they stayed, even though the south gets sent into exile, the Jewish people today find their heritage in the southern tribes. Paul was from the tribe of Benjamin. Most Jewish people are from the tribe of Judah. Some are from Simeon. Some are from Levi. But none are from Dan. Dan's shortcut eventually led to their annihilation. They might even have a remnant alive today if they had stayed. There will never be a shortage of voices who encourage us in our disobedience, our disloyalty, our distrust of the prophets and apostles. And so we must be suspicious of voices that tell us what we already want to hear. And because we are so powerfully drawn to shortcuts, specifically, particularly when it comes to our ethics and our lives and our education, we must be suspicious of voices that recommend shorter ways. Third, we must beware the voice that offers us prosperity. We must beware the voice that offers us prosperity. Look at Judges 18, beginning in verse 11. 600 men of the Danite clan, armed with weapons of war, set out from Zorah and Eshtaol, and they went up and encamped at Kiriath Jearim in Judah. On this account, that place is called Mahanadan to this day. It's west of Kiriath Jearim. From there they passed on to the hill country of Ephraim, so they're heading north. They came to the house of Micah. Then the 5 men who had gone to spy out the land, that is, Laish, said to their comrades, "Do you know that in these buildings there are an ephod?" That's a priestly garment. Teraphim, those are household gods. And an idol of cast metal. Now therefore consider what you will do. So they turned in that direction, and they came to the house of the young Levite at the home of Micah, and they greeted him. While the 600 men of the Danites, armed with their weapons of war, stood by the entrance of the gate, the 5 men who had gone to spy out the land proceeded to enter and take the idol of cast metal, the ephod, and the teraphim. The priest was standing by the entrance of the gate with the 600 men armed with weapons of war. When the men went into Micah's house and took the idol of cast metal, the ephod, and the teraphim, the priest said to them, "What are you doing?" They said to him, "Shh, keep quiet. Put your hand over your mouth and come with us and be to us a father and a priest. Is it better for you to be a priest to the house of this one person, or to be priest to a tribe and a clan of Israel?" Then the priest accepted the offer. He took the ephod, the teraphim, and the idol and went along with the people. So they resumed their journey, putting the little ones, the livestock, the goods in front of them. When they were some distance from the home of Micah, the men who were in the houses near Micah's house were called out, and they overtook the Danites. They shouted to the Danites, who turned around and said to Micah, "What's the matter that you've come with such a company?" He replied, "You take my gods that I made and the priest and go away, and what have I left? How then can you ask me what's the matter?" And the Danites said to him, "You'd better not let your voice be heard among us, or else hot-tempered fellows will attack you, and you'll lose your life and the lives of your household." Then the Danites went their way. When Micah saw that they were too strong for him, he turned back and went back to his home. Beware voices that offer prosperity. Now this priest was not qualified to be a priest. He had stolen the priesthood. He was in the wrong family. He had not had the training. He was not qualified, but it was a good living. He had a good living with Micah. 10 shekels of silver a year, a place to live, all of his utilities taken care of, food. This was a good situation. So he agreed to do something he was not qualified to do because the money was good. And then he misrepresented God to these people, and they come and they want to collect him. They like what he said to them. This is what people do, right? You tell them what they want you to come with them. And they say, this time you don't have to be priest of just one household. You're going to get a bigger church. You're going to get a bigger congregation. You're going to get to preach to thousands of people. We'll make you the priest, the high priest of the whole tribe. And does this priest for one moment think, I'm not really qualified to be a priest. I'm not sure I should do that. I mean, it's one thing to mess up this house, to mess up a whole nation. I don't think I'm going to. No, of course not. It was a promotion. So he said, well, that sounds nice. And off he goes. This priest who should not have been a priest now becomes the high priest of the tribe of Dan. The world is full of people who want what they don't deserve, who want handed to them what they won't work for, who want to be asked to bear responsibilities for which they are not qualified. And this priest is one of them. Now, his sin is bigger maybe than some of ours. But in the end, this priest leads a whole tribe into wickedness because of his refusal to recognize his qualifications. There will never be a shortage of voices who encourage our disloyalty to the prophets and apostles. And so we must be suspicious of voices that tell us what we deeply want to hear. And because we are so powerfully drawn to shortcuts and easier ways, particularly when it comes to our ethics and our spiritual lives, we must be suspicious of voices that recommend shortcuts. And because we are so drawn to voices that promise us promotion and prosperity, we must slow down and consider whether we are ready or prepared for the opportunity we are considering. And if we are not, we should do the work to be prepared for it. And if not, we should let it go. In verses 30 and 31, this is the conclusion, we find out what happened next. The Danites set up an idol for themselves. Jonathan, son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the time the land went into captivity. That's 721 BC. We're somewhere right now between 1400 and 1000. This is between 500 and 700 years of sinfulness and rebellion against God because one man took a promotion he shouldn't have. 700 years! Who was he? He was a nobody. He's just a Levite hanging around in Judah. Came across a house. I mean, what's the big deal of my choices? 700 years. So they maintained as their own Micah's idol that he had made as long as the house of God was at Shiloh. So not only did they end up priests until the fall of the north, but they also set up this idol shrine which lasted until David took the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh and moved it to Jerusalem. So that's 100 or 200 years of worshiping an idol up here. And then later on, this is where Jeroboam, son of Nebat, set up the other idol shrine. So it ends up being a sin all the way through. Looking for someone to scratch our itching ears contributes in its own way to the corruption of the world. When we live in a time of God's judgment, even when we don't, it's hard to discern God's voice, but even harder when we live in a time of judgment. We must be aware of deceptive signs. We have to be aware of these unexpected blessings, our instincts and coincidences. But even more than that, we must seek God's voice in these days, not simply a refined version of our own. We don't know it's God's voice when it resonates, because you know what resonates? Your voice in somebody else's mouth. That's what resonates. We must seek God's voice, not simply a version of our own. We must seek informed honesty of trustworthy people as opposed to comfort, confirmation, or encouragement. We must seek the most Christ-like route to God's will if we wish to hear his voice. Not the shortest and quickest route to our desire. And we must seek to be qualified and prepared for the roles that have been entrusted to us in life, whether that is a role of spouse or of parent or of employee or of manager or of CEO or of teacher or of tradesperson. Whatever it is, we must seek to be qualified and prepared for the roles that have been entrusted to us. We must not seek merely to acquire the roles themselves. If we wish to hear God's voice, there is a way of walking into that voice, the space in which he speaks. We must beware of unexpected blessings. They can deceive us so easily. We must beware of our instincts. They more speak to our desires than they do God's will. We must beware of coincidences. They can lead us along a primrose path that leads to destruction, just like happened to Micah and the Danites. We have to recognize God will speak more than once. He will speak to more than you. He will speak in multiple circumstances. And we will hear him if we seek honesty and trustworthiness in our advisors. We will hear him if we seek a Christ-like route to God's will. We will hear him if we seek to be qualified and prepared for the roles of our life. It's on those roads where we encounter God all along the way. Will you listen? Will you walk with him? I think this is what Jesus means when he says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they will be filled. This is righteousness.